Wyoming Territory, January 1883. The wind had teeth, and it bit hard. Elijah North pulled his horse to a stop at the edge of the pine brake, boots crunching snow as he dismounted. Smoke curled faint from his breath, his coat dusted white from the storm that had rolled in fast from the north. He adjusted his hat against the wind and scanned the clearing ahead. Something had caught his eye, not a deer, not a shadow of a wolf. It was still. Then it moved, a woman. She stood near a frozen creek, her dress soaked to the knees, snow clinging to the hem. Her arms were wrapped tight around a bundled infant, her back to the trees like she was trying to protect the child from the wind. Her face was pale, lips cracked, eyes hollow like she had not slept in days. Elijah stepped forward, slow and steady. "Ma'am," he said, voice low but firm, "you out here alone?" She looked up fast, like a deer that had heard a twig snap. Her knees wobbled, and for a second he thought she might fall, but she straightened, clutching the baby tighter. "Who are you?" she said, voice hoarse. "Elijah North." He stopped a few feet away, hands open, no threat. "I have a cabin not far from here. You should not be out in this storm." The child stirred in her arms, a soft, breathy cry that barely carried over the wind. She looked down at the bundle, then back at him. "Please," she whispered. "She is cold." That was all it took. "I will take care of you both," Elijah said, stepping forward. "Let me help." The woman hesitated, trembling. Then she nodded barely and let him guide her toward his horse. He wrapped his coat around her shoulders and lifted her onto the saddle, then handed her the reins and reached up for the baby. She tensed, but after a pause she let him take the child. The infant was wrapped in a thin blanket, cheeks red from the cold, but she was breathing. Light, fragile, alive. He cradled the baby inside his coat, close to his chest, where the warmth would hold. Then he led the horse through the trees, one hand steady on the reins, the other holding the child. They reached the cabin within the hour, a one-room place tucked into the hills, smoke rising from the chimney and the scent of ash and pine thick in the air. Elijah opened the door and helped her down, then carried the baby inside. He set her near the fire first, then brought her mother in after. The woman sagged into the chair like her legs had given out. He knelt by the hearth, unwrapping the baby and checking her hands, her feet. She was small, no more than a few months old, with wisps of dark hair pressed against her forehead. "She is cold, but she will be fine," Elijah said. "We will warm her slow." The woman let out a breath that broke halfway through. She leaned forward, arms out. He handed the baby back. He stoked the fire, added another log, then turned to her. "What is your name?" she blinked. Tessa Calloway," Elijah nodded. "And the little one?" "Clara." He crouched beside the chair, meeting her eyes. "Where are you from?" Tessa, her face tightened. "Miles south. My husband, he died in October. Fever. We tried to stay on the land, but the last snow took down part of the roof. I waited for help. None came." He felt it then, the weight of her silence, the kind that came from holding too much for too long. "I packed what I could and walked north," she continued, voice thin. "I heard there was a town near the pass. I did not know if it was true." "It is," Elijah said. "But it is another 2 days on foot." Tessa looked down at Clara. "I did not think we would make it. You made it here." He stood and moved to the cupboard. "And you are not going back out there." He poured hot water from the kettle, added dried herbs to a cup, and brought it to her. She took it with both hands, eyes closing as the heat seeped into her fingers. "We do not have much," he said, "but you and Clara can stay here, as long as you need." Tessa looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" Elijah sat across from her, hat in his lap. "Because no woman and child should be left to freeze in the snow." She watched him, and in her eyes something shifted. Not trust, not yet, but something close. That night, Clara slept in a cradle Elijah carved years ago, tucked close to the fire. Tessa lay on the cot near the wall, wrapped in a wool quilt. Elijah took the floor by the hearth. The cabin was quiet, save the crackle of fire and the soft breathing of 3 people who had been strangers that morning. When dawn came, the storm had passed. Light spilled in through the frost-glazed window. Elijah stirred, sat up, and glanced toward the cot. Tessa was awake, already watching him. "Thank you," she said softly. He nodded once. "You are safe now." And for the first time in weeks, something like peace settled in her chest. She believed him. The woodpile was dwindling. Elijah shouldered his axe and stepped into the morning cold. His breath fogged the air, and the snow underfoot had crusted overnight. The mule stood tethered near the lean-to, eyeing him with mild suspicion. He gave it a nod and moved to the chopping stump. Inside the cabin, faint sounds carried Tessa's voice low and rhythmic, likely humming to Clara. He hadn't expected her to rise so early, not after how hollow she'd looked the night before. But then, some women had a kind of strength that didn't call attention to itself. He split 4 logs before her footsteps creaked across the porch. She'd borrowed one of his flannel shirts, sleeves rolled, her dress hem drawn up and tied at the knees with a strip of cloth. "I can help," she said, brushing her hair behind her ear. "You shouldn't be out in this cold," Elijah said, setting another log upright. "Fire's still warm inside." "I'm not made of glass." She stepped forward. "Let me gather kindling." He studied her a moment, then nodded toward the fallen limbs near the tree line. "Watch your footing." She moved with care, boots sinking through the snow. He kept chopping, the rhythm steady, the sound echoing through the pines. Now and then he glanced her way, how she tucked broken twigs into her apron, how she paused to shift Clara against her shoulder when the baby stirred. By the time he'd filled the wood box, she had a neat bundle of branches in her arms. "Clara's warm enough?" he asked as they stepped inside. "She is sleeping better than she did the last 2 nights combined." Tessa knelt to set the kindling by the hearth. "Your cabin holds heat well." "My father built it tight, never trusted a new board when an old one would do." She stood, brushing her hands on her skirt. "You've lived here long, since '80. He poured water into the tin basin and washed his hands. "Had a brother out near Rawlins, but he took to cattle drives years back." She nodded, eyes drifting over the shelves, the worn table, the rifle above the door. "It's quiet here. That's the way I like it." She didn't press further and he didn't offer more, but he noticed how she moved more freely now, how her shoulders didn't sit quite so close to her ears. Later, while she mended a torn bonnet string, Elijah stepped out to check the trapline. He returned with 2 rabbits, cleaned them at the creek and hung them to dry near the stove. She eyed the meat with a quiet sort of approval. "You cook?" he asked, slicing potatoes. "Well enough." "Then you'll take the pan." She lifted an eyebrow but said nothing, only took it and added salt and fat from a small crock. The scent of meat and earth and fire filled the cabin until Clara stirred in her cradle and began to fuss. Elijah stepped in first, lifting her gently. "She's hungry." Tessa nodded and reached for her. Elijah turned to give her privacy, adjusting the kettle on the stove. "She was born in late August," she said. "We named her Clara after my grandmother. She had a way of making every hard thing seem smaller than it was." He didn't turn. "You favor her, I don't know, maybe. She died before I married." The silence that followed wasn't heavy, just settled. When she finished, he handed her a cloth to wrap Clara in, and for the first time she laughed softly when the baby grabbed his thumb. "You're a fair judge of character," she said to Clara. "A man who keeps his boots clean and his fire burning." "I'd say you're the tougher judge," Elijah replied. She looked up at him and something in her eyes warmed. That night, after Clara fell asleep again, Elijah stepped outside to bring in more wood. When he returned, he found Tessa standing by the stove, brushing her hair. She paused, not startled, just watching him. "You could have kept riding," she said. "That morning, I know." "Why didn't you?" "I saw a woman standing in the snow with her baby," he said, "and I knew I couldn't leave them." She didn't look away. "Elijah," she said, quiet. He waited. "I don't expect anything." "I don't have anything to offer." "I didn't ask for anything," she nodded, but her voice was steadier. "Still, you should know that I'll pull my weight. I don't take kindness lightly." "I didn't offer kindness," he said. "I offered care." Tessa blinked once, then looked toward the cradle. "Then I accept." He nodded and moved to the hearth, adding another log to the fire. Outside, the wind had died. Inside, the warmth held. Neither of them said more that night, but when she passed behind him to check the kettle, her hand brushed his shoulder just once, and he didn't move away. The days began to stretch longer, though the cold held firm. By the end of January, the snow had packed hard across the meadows, and the pines stood heavy with frost. Elijah cleared a path each morning from the cabin to the creek's edge with the flat of his shovel, the handle worn from years of use. Tessa followed behind with Clara wrapped snug against her chest, her boots steady now, her eyes clearer. Elijah noticed the way she moved without hesitation, how she no longer waited for him to speak first. She had begun sewing a second pair of mittens from an old flannel shirt, and when he came in from feeding the mule, she handed them to him without a word. "You've done this before," he said, flexing his fingers inside the stitching. "I had to learn. My mother said a woman should know how to keep warmth where there's none." He studied the threadwork, firm and even. "She taught you well." Tessa folded the rest of the cloth into her satchel. "She taught me to be careful with what I give." Elijah gave a nod, then moved to check the oil lamp. "You always this direct?" "Only when I think it'll matter." That night the wind shifted from the east and a brittle cold seeped between the logs. Elijah stoked the fire high before bedding down. Tessa sat beside the cradle, rocking Clara with the heel of her boot, her shawl drawn tight around her shoulders. "Elijah," she said after a while, "what brought you this far into the hills?" He looked up from his bedroll. "Didn't take to the towns." "Never have." "That all?" He turned his gaze to the ceiling beams. "I had a fiancée once, back in Missouri. She got tired of waiting while I chased land out west, married a banker." Tessa didn't answer right away. Clara had drifted off, and she reached down to adjust the baby's cap. "Did you love her?" "I thought I did. Maybe I loved the idea more than the woman." She looked over her shoulder. "You still think about her?" "No," he said. "Not in a long time." She let the silence linger. Then, softly, "I married Ben Calloway because he was kind to my father. He wasn't cruel, but we didn't grow into each other." Elijah sat up, folding his blanket. "You regretted it?" "No, I just didn't expect to end up alone so soon. I don't know who I am without him yet." "You're a mother," he said. "That counts for more than most." Her mouth pulled into something quieter than a smile. "I still wake up and reach for him." He didn't move closer, but his voice dropped. "It fades, not fast, but it does." The next morning, Tessa stood at the table, slicing dried apples for a stew. Elijah came in with the post from the trapline, a fox, lean but healthy. He hung it by the door and washed his hands. "I'll take the pelt south come spring," he said. "Trade it at Red Hill." "Could I go with you?" she asked. He looked at her, then at Clara in the cradle. "You planning to leave?" "No, I just mean I'd like to see what's beyond the ridge. I've only ever passed through." "Then we'll go together." She nodded and returned to her cutting board. "I want Clara to know the world's bigger than what we've lost." When she passed him later to rinse the apples, her hand grazed his forearm. This time, she didn't pull back. The days began to find a rhythm. Elijah taught her to split kindling with the back of the axe and showed her where the wild ginger grew beneath the snowpack. She taught him how to stretch flour with oat mash and how to quiet a baby with a hum that dipped at the end like a lull. One evening, as the sun bled orange against the mountain line, Elijah stood outside with his rifle slung over his shoulder. Tessa joined him on the porch, Clara asleep in her arms. "You think it'll thaw early?" she asked. "Could be." "Birds are already starting to shift." She leaned against the post. "I used to think spring was just a word." He glanced at her. "What do you think now?" She looked down at Clara's soft cheek, then out toward the trees. "I think it's a promise." Elijah turned toward her, his voice quiet. "You've got a mind for rebuilding. I never had a choice." "You do now." She lifted her gaze. "Do I? You can stay, for good if you want." Tessa searched his face, and something opened in hers, not hope, not yet, but the shape of something that could become it. "I'd like that," she said. "But I won't be kept, not even kindly." "You won't be, you'll be chosen." She held his eyes a moment longer, then looked down at Clara, who stirred and pressed closer to her chest. "I reckon we'll choose you back," she said. Elijah nodded once and stepped down into the snow, his boots sinking deep, his heart lighter than it had been in years. And behind him, on the porch, Tessa stayed standing even after he disappeared into the trees. By mid-February, the creek had begun to shift beneath its crust, whispering beneath layers of ice. Sap ran under the bark again, and the mule stood longer in the sun near the fence, head cocked as if listening for something just beyond the ridge. Tessa stood by the window, sleeves rolled to her elbows, patching a worn muslin sheet with deliberate stitches. Clara lay tucked on a folded quilt near the hearth, cooing softly to herself. Elijah returned from the ridge trail with his saddlebag slung over one shoulder and snow clinging to the cuffs of his trousers. He'd taken to scouting the pass every few days now, watching for signs of melt or movement from the scattered cabins tucked farther down the valley. "You're walking different," Tessa said without glancing up from her stitching. He set the saddlebag down near the door. "Ground softer, boots sink in deeper." She tied off a thread and bit it clean. "That's not what I meant." Elijah set his hat on the peg and stepped into the warmth. "There's a wagon track cutting east across the flat. Could have come from Red Hill, might be early traders." She looked up then, steady. "You worried about them?" "I don't like surprises." She reached for a second patch square. "Then it's good you've got company now." He gave a slow nod and sat on the low bench near the fire. Clara flailed her arms and let out a soft squawk, and he leaned down to offer her his finger. She gripped it tight, her face scrunching with effort. "She's strong," he said. Tessa didn't look away from her work. "She'll have to be." They sat quiet for a time, the only sound the thread pulling through cloth and the occasional pop from the fire. Elijah finally broke the silence. "Ridge Trail cuts close to the old homestead south of here. Place with a collapsed barn and a well half covered in rock." Tessa paused. "I know it. Someone's been through, footprints, not fresh but not more than a week old, no wagon, just boots." Tessa set her sewing aside. "Could be someone passing through." "Could be." She crossed her arms, eyes narrowing slightly. "Are you asking if I know who it might be?" "I'm asking if anyone might be looking for you." She didn't answer right away, her mouth pressed into a line, not defensive, just measured. "There was a man who worked with Ben during the last planting season. Cattle runner from further east. He came by often after Ben died, saying he could help with the roof. Always brought something cornmeal, molasses." Elijah kept his gaze steady. "Did he ask for anything in return?" "Not until he asked me to leave with him. Said a woman alone had no business holding land." "Did he take no for an answer?" Not kindly. Elijah shifted in his seat. "You think he's still looking?" "I don't know." "But he knew I was heading north." He stood, crossing to the window. The trees beyond swayed in the wind, branches shedding fine powder in slow, drifting veils. "If you see him again," he said, voice low, "you won't face it alone." Tessa's hands curled into the folds of her skirt. "I don't want Clara growing up afraid." "She won't." Later, as dusk settled and the shadows stretched long across the floorboards, Elijah lit the lantern and trimmed the wick. Tessa moved about the cabin quietly, her steps sure now, her gestures practiced. She handed him a tin cup filled with warm cider steeped with spruce tip and a sliver of ginger root he'd traded for last fall. "You ever think about leaving this place?" she asked, not looking at him. "I did. Years back after Pa died, thought I might head to Montana. Heard the land was wide and the rivers stayed clean." "What stopped you?" He looked toward Clara, who had fallen asleep with one hand curled beneath her cheek. "Didn't seem right to carry grief into new soil." Tessa sat across from him, cradling her own cup. "Maybe it's not about leaving grief behind. Maybe it's about who carries it with you." Elijah watched her, the way the lamplight softened the edge of her jaw, the way her eyes didn't flinch from his. "You think about staying?" he asked. "I do." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "What would keep you?" She took a quiet breath. "A place where no one has to ask if they're wanted." Elijah reached across the small space between them, not hurried, not uncertain. His calloused hand found hers, fingers rough but careful. She didn't pull away. "Then stay," he said. Not because you must, because you're welcome. Tessa looked down at their joined hands, then up at him again. I want a life where Clara grows up knowing what steady looks like. That's what I want too. The fire crackled low, and outside the wind had gone still. Inside, something settled between them, unspoken but understood. Not a beginning, not exactly. Just the first moment when neither of them felt like they were waiting anymore. By the first week of March, the ridge trail ran slick with meltwater, and the air held a wet, earthen scent that hadn't been present in months. The thaw was early but not unwelcome. Elk tracks crisscrossed the far slope, and the crows had returned, calling sharp against the pale sky. Elijah repaired the fence line with quiet purpose, wrapping new wire where the old had rusted through. He'd offered Tessa the larger hammer, but she'd shaken her head and taken the smaller one, driving staples with a precision that made him glance over more than once. "We could use chickens come spring," she said, hammer resting on her thigh. "There's room enough for a coop behind the shed, and Clara'll be old enough to toddle about by summer," he nodded. "I can trade for pullets in Red Hill." She leaned back on her heels, brushing hair from her face with the back of her wrist. "And if I cleaned up the lean-to, we might fit a second cradle or a cot." Elijah paused mid-swing. Expecting someone, she laughed then, low and steady. "Not yet." "But I'm not ruling it out." He turned toward her, shoulders easing. "You thinking about staying that long?" "I already stayed," she said. "I'm thinking about building." That night, after Clara settled against her quilt with a full belly and pink cheeks, Tessa took her shawl and stepped outside. Elijah followed, lantern in hand, and hung it from the porch hook. The light spilled out into the snowmelt, casting long gold streaks across the yard. She didn't say anything at first, only stood with her arms crossed, her eyes on the dark tree line. "Then I've been thinking about my father." Elijah waited. He was a carpenter. Not a grand one, just barns and sheds mostly, but he had this way of checking every beam twice. "Always told me it wasn't about doubt, it was about care." She looked over at him. "That's what this place feels like." Like someone checked it twice. He rested one hand on the porch post. "You've filled more of this cabin in 2 months than I did in 3 years. You left space for it." He stepped closer, slow. "There's room for more if you want it." "I do." She turned to face him fully. "But I need to ask something." "All right. If I plant a garden and raise chickens and let Clara grow up calling this home, are you with me in it, not just in the work, in the life?" "I already am," he said. "But if you need it spoken plain, I want a life with you, Tessa." "You and Clara." She reached up and touched his cheek, fingers light but steady. "Then you'll have it." He leaned into her hand just slightly, then bent and kissed her gentle, sure, like a man who'd waited until there was no longer anything left to weigh. That spring, Elijah built the chicken coop behind the shed, just as she'd said. Tessa planted turnips and carrots and a row of beans along the south wall. Clara took her first steps barefoot in the new grass, hands outstretched toward the sun. They went to Red Hill in early April with the mule hitched to Elijah's cart. Tessa bought bolts of cloth and 2 hens with feathers the color of rust. Elijah traded pelts for seed and a new kettle. They came home with a wagon full of beginnings. When the Reverend came through on his circuit in June, they were married under the tall pine near the creek. Tessa wore a dress she'd stitched herself, and Clara clapped her hands when Elijah kissed her mother. No guests, no fanfare, just vows spoken clear and hands held tight. By autumn, the garden had yielded enough to fill 3 crates with preserves. Tessa lined the shelves with jars of pickled beets and wild plum jam. Elijah carved Clara a wooden horse and a stool to reach the table. They didn't speak much of the past. What mattered lived in the way Elijah brushed snow from her shoulders before she stepped inside, and the way Tessa leaned her head against his chest when the fire burned low. Their love was built slow, like the cabin itself, beam by beam with care. The man who had once offered to take Tessa from her land never came. Elijah kept watch through that first season, but nothing stirred but deer and wind. In time, the worry faded, and the only visitors they saw were the two traders who passed in summer and the reverend, who returned each year and always stayed for supper. They lived quiet. They lived strong, and they lived together. On Clara's 5th birthday, Elijah gave her a carved cradle for her doll, and Tessa baked a honey cake with dried apples from their tree. That night, after the child had fallen asleep curled against her quilt, Tessa stood beside Elijah on the porch once more, the lantern light flickering around them. "She's growing fast," he said. "She'll be taller than me by 12, still not too old to be tucked in." Tessa looked up at him, her eyes soft with years of knowing. "You've given her what I never had. She gave me what I never thought I'd have." Tessa slipped her hand into his. "We both did." He turned and kissed her again, the way he always did, without urgency, without question, just steady and whole. They stayed that way a long time, the wind brushing through the trees, the stars sharp overhead. And inside, a fire burned warm and a child slept safe, and the world outside their door held nothing they needed, only each other. Always each other.